Greetings, friends. This is Bradley Jersak, and we are finishing up our recorded lessons today for Quest for Meaning, our examination of some of the great existentialists or their forerunners. So far, we've had a very close look at Albert Camus and Dostoevsky through their novels. We've enjoyed examining Crime and Punishment and The Plague. And then we moved on last time to contesting our faith from the point of view of Nietzsche. Today we're going to be looking at how we contest our faith through the eyes of Kierkegaard. And so you can see in this first cover slide that both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard really believed that authentic Christians ought to test their faith to see whether it's authentic or not. Nietzsche's example was to try your faith by losing it, and we covered that in our last lesson. He believed that if you set aside faith, your Christian faith, that perhaps you'll discover you didn't actually need it, or that if you did need it, that's problematic. In a sense, he sets up a double bind, but he can imagine those Christians who work through the loss of their faith and discover that it in fact was authentic and should be lived out. The issue with Nietzsche's approach, of course, was what does he mean by losing your faith? Does he mean simply turning off belief? Can you really do that? Do we pretend we don't believe? That seems like a pretty privileged point of view. Also, does he mean turning off Christian family and isolating ourselves from the community? Not just that we stop going to church, but do we lose the whole connection that we have if we're in a network of friends who are believers? And is that realistic? Perhaps if you go off into the desert or go to another city, you could cut yourselves off from those in your world. Is that really a way to test your faith? And then perhaps most of all, what parts of living our faith does he suggest losing? Would we really want to say, well, I suppose to lose my Christian faith, I should stop loving my neighbor. I should stop being kind to others. I should stop forgiving and not only drop Christian belief or Christian attendance, but Christian practice. And to me, that seems like it may compromise our own personhood if we've been formed and shaped in positive Christian ways. And I'm wondering if he means that we should actually become narcissists in this. I don't think he's getting at that, and yet I don't see a way to avoid that. It's a glitch in his way of contesting our faith. Kierkegaard comes at it with just as much rigor, but he says we want to find our faith, and we find our faith by trying it. So you don't prove that Christianity is true by setting aside. You prove that Christianity is true by walking the Christian path and discovering whether or not it will be something life-affirming, whether it will be something authentic, whether it will cause you to grow and bear good fruit. That would be how you find your faith, by walking the path of Jesus. And we're going to go into that in more detail and ask what he meant by that. So essentially, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are at odds on the question of the need for God. Nietzsche saw Christianity as a slave religion of the weak. He believed that it perpetuated a life-draining victim identity, and he believed that it would cause us to justify resentment, and empower a kind of anti-personhood, or we could say a dehumanizing sort of approach to the world and to life. And he doesn't only blame this on Christianity, he sees Jesus Christ himself as a kind of utter weakling who has set us on the path to religious slavery. In fact, at one point, Simone Weil, without using his name because she just refused to do so, says that yes, in fact, Christianity is the religion of slaves. It is meant for the afflicted, for the oppressed, for the disenfranchised and the disinherited. And that it doesn't keep them down in a weak slave mentality, but it has historically caused them to rise up and to affirm life where there was none, and to experience faith as a way of regaining agency in the world. Even as we consent to our affliction, it's a willing consent that involves radical forgiveness and overcoming power and patient endurance. And so far from thinking that Christianity should not be a slave religion, she thinks that's precisely what it's meant to be. This is what it makes it so much more difficult for someone like Nietzsche, who lived a privileged life and could sort of imagine setting things aside and didn't have to live under the domination of others. Now, Kierkegaard, by contrast, said that the need for God, it's not weakness, it's actually perfection. And I'm quoting him from his book, Provocations, which is a compendium that I recommend. It really gathers together the writings of Kierkegaard from his own perspective. As a side note, Kierkegaard wrote a lot of books from various points of view using pseudonyms, some of them directly opposed to his own convictions, and that's why he wrote them as other characters. The difficulty is that once folks realized it was Kierkegaard who wrote them, they started attaching his name to the books as if that was his perspective, and this is incorrect. And so Provocations draws together a lot of his best of kind of commentary and puts it in a book that gathers up his actual perspective rather than the alternative characters he was playing elsewhere. He says this: in a human being's relationship to God, the more one needs God, the more perfect he is. To need God is nothing to be ashamed of, but is perfection itself. It is the saddest thing in the world if a human being goes through life without discovering that he needs God. Now, that's not just a kind of perpetual neediness that can't be satisfied through relationship. What he's talking about is living in denial, living as part of the herd that doesn't even recognize its need for mercy. And how troubling that would be if we could live our lives and actually believe we are not in need of God. It's a delusion in his mind. It would be a little bit like the shadowy figure of Plato's cave, where the one who is chained with his face to the wall only sees his own shadow projected there and thinks that's reality, when in fact reality is that we need God. Soren Kierkegaard begins with the invitation. Jesus says, "Come to me." He says, "This invitation stands at the crossroad, where temporal and earthly suffering has planted its cross, and here it beckons. Come here. All you poor and miserable, you who must slave in poverty to eke out an existence with nothing more than a toilsome future, come here. All you despised and discarded ones, those whose existence no one cares about, not even as much as for a domestic animal that has more value. All you sick, lame, deaf, blind, crippled, insane, come here. The invitation blasts away all distinctions in order to gather everybody together." And so you can see here where, on the one hand, Nietzsche felt that Christian faith would actually drive one into slavery, into a kind of moral sickness, into being socially and emotionally lame, deaf, blind, crippled, and insane. He saw that as the fruit of Christianity. What Soren Kierkegaard says, in reality, the human condition is a place of affliction, temporal and earthly suffering. And we run into it. And that's where, in our own affliction, we are driven directly to the cross. And at the cross, those who are sick, lame, deaf, blind, crippled, insane, they are invited into a kind of union with Jesus Christ, where in the union there's an exchange. Give me your poverty, and I will give you my spiritual, emotional health. Give me your indebtedness, and I will give you freedom, and you won't be indentured slaves to the world system anymore. Give me your helplessness, your powerlessness, and I will give you agency back. And so this invitation from Jesus Christ is at the heart of Soren Kierkegaard's testing of faith. Do you need this? And if you don't, if you're not done, if you haven't bottomed out on self-will, on selfishness, on the capital S self, that is actually a bondage to egoism and its demands, well, then go get done. Go bottom out. But don't imagine that as a kind of healthy Christianity. What you need to do is actually walk the way of Jesus. And now you can hear I've just made a distinction between the Christian brand or Christendom that Kierkegaard was as critical of as Nietzsche, and then being a Jesus follower. What he was seeing in his time, and I think what we're seeing in ours that makes him so incredibly relevant, is the distance between Christendom and Jesus following, between the path of the Christian brand, which has been so tainted in our era, and the way of Jesus, which is a rigorous call, but also a beautiful call because it beckons us to be healed. You can see in this slide that Kierkegaard had a deep commitment to distinguishing also then the crowd or the herd, the religious crowd, and as over against the individual. And this is very similar to Nietzsche as well. They both saw an incredible danger of the mob. Those who say, I'm just following orders. Those who follow the herd, even if it's the church herd, the Christian crowd. What Dostoevsky saw as the herd of swine plunging into the Sea of Gennesaret when we read about the Gadarene demoniac. The crowd is dangerous. The crowd is a place where you lack accountability and do all kinds of things when the mob mentality is greater than your own will to live freely and as an individual. Now, of course, being individualistic can become a problem of itself. And in some ways, Kierkegaard is regarded as the father of modern individualism. And the kind of radical individualism that we see today, that is my way or the highway, I did it my way, and no one tells me what to do, that's a very twisted, a shadow side of what Kierkegaard was attempting. He's talking about standing out against the pressures of the herd or society or the world system as one who knows that one day they will be accountable before God. You are going to have to face God on your own in terms of how you made use of your life. You're not going to get to use denial or blame or scapegoating on that final day. It will be you, with the book of your life opened, to see how you responded to the needs around you, to the calling that you've been given, to the injustices that you encounter, and even to what you do with your own life. It's your life. It's your canvas, and how will you paint on it? And so you can see how that can be misused and disordered into a kind of individualism that's very alienating and self-seeking and self-centered, or self-loathing and self-hating. So yes, beware of radical individualism today and how it is prone to push back against connection, against community, and lose belonging. But don't miss Kierkegaard's point that the crowd is used in order to conceal how empty all existence is. The many transfer us into an exalted state, just as OPM does, and we are tranquilized by the tremendous trustworthiness of millions. If you want to be loathsome to God, just run with the herd. And so he's talking about how we tend to trust the majority, even when the majority, the trendy, becomes oppressive of the other. And of course, this is prophetic of what would happen in Nazi Germany. Both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard could see it coming in that sense, that if we just trust whatever direction the millions are taking, you do get a tyranny of the majority. From a political science point of view, that is why we have Supreme Courts. And the Supreme Court can be a way that the rule of law trumps a fascist majority. And so I think that's a part of the system where it's meant to protect us when the majority becomes swayed as a herd by some oppressor or dictator, for example. But on a more personal level, he sees how the herd or the trends of the day can tranquilize us. We become numbed out and mindless, thoughtless, and it's a call for the mindfulness of the individual. And so he says this: every call from God is always addressed to one person, the single individual. Precisely in this lies the difficulty and the examination, that the one who is called out must stand alone, walk alone, alone with God, the single individual. With this category, the cause of Christ stands or falls. Because we've gone through many decades of radical individualism, I think it is fair for us to push back there a little bit and say, actually, we are called to community, and it's where 2 or 3 are gathered in his name that we see him present. And it is in those communities that we find belonging, that we experience grace. And I think here is where another great thinker, Martin Buber, can help us. What Buber said is he distinguished between the individual who stands alone and the person who is formed in relationship. And Kierkegaard was not that far yet in his thinking, but Buber kind of then transcends this idea of the individual to say individuals tend to function in I-it relationships where that objectify and depersonalize the other. Persons, on the other hand, are formed in relationships, and it's like the children in the cribs in Romania after events like Chernobyl, and there's these little children that didn't have connection, didn't have face contact, didn't have the experience of being held, and their personhood never developed, and they remained feral. And so it's really important that we would see that the individual, yes, is responsible, subjective, and authentic, but that there's a call to personhood that is shaped by love for one another, love for brother and sister, love for neighbor, even love for the stranger, and ultimately the enemy. And so I don't think that Jesus' resistance to the temple establishment means that he's calling us to the kind of single individual vision that Kierkegaard has here. He's calling us to be part of the company of disciples, but you never get to follow that as the crowd or the herd, so that you can excuse yourself from responsibility, from authenticity, from being the subject, and who has to manage their own actions in this world. And so we recognize the danger of the crowd. We recognize the limitations of the individual, and we're called to be I-thou persons. In his critique of the church, or Christendom really, Kierkegaard sees this as a great counterfeit. By Christendom, what he means is the ways that a society comes to think of itself as Christian. So he's in Denmark. And in Denmark at the time, when you were born, your baptism automatically made you a citizen of Denmark. To be from Denmark was to be a Christian, isn't it? And the social pressures around that included church attendance, whether you really believed or not, whether you even thought about the reality of Christ or how you would live it in this world. But, you were expected to be in church. You, in fact, probably wanted to be in church so you could connect with those in your community. You would see your friends and your social mates, your business partners. It was sort of a civil gathering. With a thin Christian veneer through the liturgy, but certainly Kierkegaard saw Christendom as a kind of social counterfeit. The established church, to him, is far more dangerous to Christianity than any heresy or schism. He says, we play at Christianity. We use all the Orthodox Christian terminology, but everything without character. And there's something frightful in the fact that the most dangerous thing of all, playing at Christianity, is never included in the list of heresies and schisms. The greatest danger to Christianity is, I contend, not heresies, heterodoxies, not atheists, not profane secularism, no, but the kind of orthodoxy which is cordial drivel, mediocrity served up sweet. You see, he can be just as harsh as Nietzsche. But the very essence of Christianity is utterly opposed to this mediocrity, in which it does not so much die as dwindle away. Now, I can really see his point. And in his day, the great danger of Christendom, the kind of the religious establishment, it did have this effect. It was a withering impulse that really could erode the authenticity, the reality, the goodness of Christianity. It was corrosive to all things actually Jesus following. Today we're up against a similar problem, but I would say far worse. What I agree with is that the greatest danger in Christianity today is not the new atheist. It's not Richard Dawkins or Hitchens. It's not the Islamist radicals who, hate our freedom and all of that. Rather, the greatest danger to Christianity is not mediocrity served up sweet, but now served up bitter. We've gone to a different place where there is a kind of resentment that Nietzsche warned us about, and that there's a sense of victim mentality where, like, the world is all against us. So what are we going to do? We're going to use worldly means to try to push back, to take over, and to become the oppressor. And so in that sense, his worries about Christianity are so valid, but they're only the warm-up act for something even more dangerous that's at work today in this world, in the church, in my opinion. An example of that, the radical forgiveness called for by Jesus Christ in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, when presented in a recent poll to church-going Christians. So these aren't marginal Christians. These are church-going, active Christians who ranged from progressive all the way to conservative. When presented with Jesus' call to forgiveness, over 70% in both groups rejected it. The conservatives, upward to 74% of church-going conservative Christians said that the radical forgiveness called for by Jesus in that paragraph in Matthew was compromise with unrighteousness. In the progressive wing, over 72% said it is complicity with injustice. And so here you have ideological herds from left and right agreeing against the very words of Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount. That's the kind of danger we're talking about. Richard Dawkins holds nothing up to that. He can't infect Christianity except perhaps with more resentment. The fact is that within the church, now a kind of societal resentment has co-opted our very perspective such that we're overtly able to push aside the words of Christ and his fairly high demands. We don't like those kind of challenges, and we have a million excuses why he's probably wrong, or that we have to more covertly call the gospel to dwindle away where it's demanding in any sense. He says this: the church is fearful of stating the requirements of authentic Christianity, quote, perhaps because it is afraid people would shudder to see at what a distance from it we are living. Strictly speaking, he says, it is not I who am ringing the alarm bell. I'm starting the fire in order to smoke out illusions and knavish tricks. It is a police raid, and a Christian police raid, for according to the New Testament, Christianity is incendiarism. That's quite a strong statement. He's actually saying, I'm the one who's starting the fire. He wants to burn up all that is false within Christianity. It's quite a contrast to Dostoevsky's sense of the arsonists, who he sees as progressives in his novel Demons or the Possessed. So for Kierkegaard, there needs to be a fire lit in the church to burn up all that which is not authentic Christianity. For Dostoevsky, he saw that the progressivists who were attacking the church actually did want to burn down the whole thing, to burn down faith. They rightly critiqued the mediocrity of Christendom and of the aristocracy. But in their resentment, it actually did become nihilistic and ultimately violent under the Bolsheviks, and then finally the Stalinist reign. And so these are two different kinds of arson. And on the one hand, we have the fire of God that consumes all that which in us is not of love's kind. And we want that fire. Our God is a consuming fire in that sense. And on the other hand, Dostoevsky warns us about a kind of resentment-driven resistance to the establishment that actually becomes violent and is not the Jesus way of doing the very same kind of resistance. It's, yeah, this stuff needs to be burned up and smoked out, but you can do it the Jesus way, or you can do it the demonic way. Well, what has Christianity become today? How might Kierkegaard confront our church? How would he look at the church in Europe, the church in North America, the church in Australia, New Zealand? I'm thinking about all of these as the Western Christianity. I think it's fair to say that he would see a consumeristic entertainment industry. He would see a cult of personality. He would see a civil religion that's been politicized and captured by ideology. And he would have a lot to write about this. And he would be able to show you the receipts. He would be able to show you the scandalous ways in which the herd has been co-opted by world systems and then pasted it over what was meant to be Christian. It's the Christian cross wrapped in tinsel and flags. And I think this indeed is a counterfeit. And so he's a prophet for us today, certainly. Well, his solution, that was glum. Let's talk about his solution. He says, what if we became Christian? He doesn't say become Christians, as in, well, pray this prayer, say this confession, get baptized, and participate in church life. No, they were already doing that. But what he's saying is that the great failure in the Christian church was in becoming Christian, discipleship. So for him, discipleship includes the following. It includes becoming followers of Jesus, not just fans. And following means emulating. Following means scary words that we've become allergic to, like obey, submit, and that we have not seen how In fact, we've obeyed and submitted to the culture, to society and its ills, and so we really have become even obedient to our own egoism and its demands. But he says, no, we need to become followers of Jesus and not just watch him from afar and cheer his miracles and applaud his teaching, but actually to walk in his footsteps, to take up your cross and follow him. Nobody was saying that in his churches. He also calls us to faith, not reason. Now, this is not the kind of anti-science, anti-reason rhetoric that you get sometimes in especially on the Christian right today. Rather, he's talking about a faith that's demanding, where you actually have to trust God with your life at a level that may seem unreasonable. And so he wants our Christianity to be not just a matter of the head, but of the heart, and from the heart out to the hands. And so this is the movement he's looking for in discipleship, that a purely theological, heady religion is actually powerless to create transformation in the world or in a human life. But if we can take the life and the message of Jesus from our heads, then down into our hearts as act of trust, stepping out in faith to live the way Christ calls us in Matthew 6, to truly believe that we have a heavenly Father who wants to take care of us. What if we actually believe that? And then how would we act on that faith? So from heart then to hands. And this is number 3, that we would go into action, not just doctrine. And so a doctrinaire Christianity, again, there's a beauty to doctrine, but it's only meant to be descriptive of the real Christian life, led by the Holy Spirit, that looks Christ-like in action in the real world. And so discipleship is about faith. It's about action. And in his book, Fear and Trembling, we see that Kierkegaard talks about Abraham and how he stepped out in faith, in fear and in trembling. Now, this has become a very famous book for Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. It's his analogy of Abrahamic faith and how he congratulates that. But here's the trick. He was writing this book under a pseudonym as well. And ultimately for him, the leap of faith that Abraham took into the unknown isn't the apex of Christian faith. Following Jesus is, and that's quite different. And so that's, to be a Jesus follower is the true Kierkegaardian doctrine of discipleship. And this is where Christ, where we need to exceed the faith of Abraham, and that we're not just operating in a vacuum or with a projection of God and what we think God would have us do, but with the actual content of the Jesus of the Gospels. That's who you follow. And if there's a fear and trembling, it's in that. And so this is an important distinction, one that Stephen Backhouse, an expert on Kierkegaard, has shown me and warned me about when I was writing on fear and trembling in my book, Out of the Embers. And he brings a marvelous corrective to that, and gratefully in time before I published. So thank you to Stephen Backhouse. And if you want probably the best book on Kierkegaard in terms of his life and teaching, very accessible, Kierkegaard, A Solitary Life. He also talks about true freedom versus false freedom. So sometimes we think that true freedom looks like this, that I'm unconditionally free to make a choice that could just as well be good or evil. The fact that I can choose between good and evil, that's free choice. That's real freedom. I can turn towards the light. I can turn from the light. I can turn towards the good. I can turn towards evil. But the fact that I can turn is the essence of freedom. And he says a huge no to that. He says, actually, that's an abrogation of freedom. And it leads to its own kind of slavery, because you become slave to the impulses of the choice in the moment. And who are you obeying when you imagine that your arbitrary choices are the manifestation of true freedom? He goes, no, that's a false freedom. Rather, he says, Christianity teaches that you should choose the one thing needful, but in such a way that there must be no question of any choice. Freedom really is freedom only when in the same moment, the same second, it rushes with infinite speed to bind itself. Freedom is the choice whose truth is that there can be no question of any choice. So what he's talking about, we see this in Maximus the Confessor, where he says, we have been created with what Maximus called a natural will. And the natural will is always inclined to the good. And freedom is our capacity to always choose the good. On the other hand, Maximus talks about the gnomic will, Gnomic. And the gnomic will is the one that vacillates between good and evil, that turns to, turns from, turns away, turns on, turns off. And that is a kind of dysfunction of the will, and in its own kind of slavery. And so that's something we can think about in terms of Maximus and Kierkegaard, where we have this interesting modern hymn that uses the line, "It's only in your will that I am free." And so then freedom becomes the result or the fruit of surrender to the care of a loving God. Freedom is the good fruit of obedience to the good and to unwavering loyalty to that which is best. And so much so that we don't even consider turning away. That would be the true freedom. Whereas especially with someone like Nietzsche, freedom for him is like living beyond good and evil, and so we see that kind of devastating effects of course, in Crime and Punishment, where Raskolnikov experiences the bondage of living beyond moral boundaries and making himself the arbiter of what is good. It didn't work out for him. He only ultimately finds freedom when he turns to the light in a way where he's not going to turn from it. And so for Kierkegaard, he's saying you're really most free when there's no longer any question of choice. And why not? Because the only choice is love. And whatever is not love will lead you to slavery. And it leads you to bondage. It leads you to the bad fruit of turning from love. So if we imagine turning from love to radical autonomy as freedom, we've just recapitulated the fall of Adam and Eve. But if we look at the true freedom in another garden, the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus says, "Not my will but yours," that kind of consent includes the true agency, the true freedom to rest in the will of God. And that's a tough sell. In fact, Jesus will say, not many people want to do that. It's a narrow road. It's a small door. Few are those who opt for it. And especially so within the church, from Kierkegaard's point of view. And I think he makes a good point there. We had true freedom, false freedom. Now we have true faith and false faith. He says, by faith, Abraham went out from the land of his fathers and became a sojourner in the land of promise. He left his earthly understanding behind, and he took faith with him. And so again, faith in this case is action, not belief as doctrinal assent. Citing the creed week after week doesn't make you a Christian. It doesn't say anything about your faith. In fact, right now, as I record this, we still have, the Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill, who cites beautiful doctrine every day in the liturgy, and every Sunday he's affirming the Nicene Creed. And meanwhile, what are the fruits of his actions? He has created this doctrine of the Russian world that has led to a justification of the invasion of Ukraine. That's the doctrinal assent has not prevented moral degradation in faith. Faith is an action. Christianity is an action. Being Christian is an action. So Christ uses only one proof. If you do my Father's will. He should know whether the teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. This implies that an action situation is necessary before the decision of faith can come into existence. It is a venture. It is not a matter of proof first and then the venture. No, first adventure and then the proof. And again, this is more from his Fear and Trembling book, but I think where he would apply that then is you embark on taking up your cross, following the Jesus way, and seeing where that venture leads you, and that this will be the proof of true faith. And it's how we contest our faith. It's how we test our faith as authentic or not. Have you noticed how many times I've said authentic during this lesson? This, of course, is one of the key themes to existentialism and why we would regard Kierkegaard as one of its fathers. He's looking for authentic faith, and that authentic faith looks like a life that follows Jesus. Especially in this regard, to become Christian is to love, God's love. He says God's love is a hidden spring that flows from within. And so this is a kind of true love, and that hidden spring that flows then leads us to love God, and then it leads us to see that love is a duty, and that we love others as they are, not just despite of who they are, or for their potential, or if I could lead them to the Lord. No, we love them as they are, and this is the duty of a Christian disciple who is flowing in the love of God. He describes it as non-preferential love of neighbor, not just for friends or lovers. And this is then the kind of love that shows mercy. And this is exactly, again, what the Sermon on the Mount tells us, both Matthew and the Luke version, where Jesus describes us as a call to be perfect as our Heavenly Father is perfect. And he's not talking about the bullseye of moral perfection. To be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect is to imitate him in his indiscriminate love and hospitality for all. That we don't just bring our friends and families to our banquets, we bring the outsider, we bring the stranger, we bring those we might not be comfortable with. And he says, well, if you do that, you're becoming like your Father in heaven, who causes the sun to shine and the rain to fall on both righteous and wicked alike. It's indiscriminate in that sense. And because it is, it will include showing mercy to those who we don't think deserve mercy. And it's then going to go all the way into this radical idea of enemy love. And for Kierkegaard and for others since him, like Saint Silouan the Athonite, enemy love becomes the most powerful discernment tool of whether you're walking in the Jesus way. Because almost anything else, according to Silouan, can be counterfeited in the flesh. But love of enemy, you can't love your enemy very long in the flesh before that disintegrates. And so the authentic, contested Christian faith will look like a kind of love that extends even to those who we regard as enemies or who regard us as enemies. And it looks like it looks like praying and blessing them with the mercy we want for ourselves. And at some point, that's a miracle. And it's an act of grace that's given. And it goes much further than my own, let's say, repression of inner violence so I can act nicely. No, this is the supernatural love of God giving us real grace in the moment for those who would not wish us well, and maybe vice versa. So to become Christian is to love. The book I mentioned, of course, is Provocations, and the great thing about Kierkegaard is that his provocations are sweeping. He doesn't just go after the church and how bad the church has been, and I'm an ex-church person now. No, He is going after modernity as a whole era and a philosophy. He's going after society across the whole spectrum of his nation in Europe. And of course, he's going after Christendom, which we've already covered. And so he's provoking them and poking the bear, so to speak. But he also provokes deconstruction itself. He challenges deconstruction and doubt and defensiveness wherever he sees it. So you're not off the hook just because you join him in your critique of Christendom. Then he will turn the guns on you, so to speak, and he shows us in the language of today how deconstruction can become its own construct. And as its own construct, it becomes an obstacle to true faith, just as Christendom was. So the best of deconstruction removes obstacles to faith. It removes the chains and the bindings that keep us from being life-affirming. But when deconstruction becomes its own construct, or even today, its own industry virtually, it too can become an obstacle, and Kierkegaard will have none of it. And so he observes how this kind of deconstruction, under other names, can become very defensive, which is ironic because deconstruction is all about removing the mental and ideological and religious defenses. So for it to become defensive it's as ironic as, let's say, becoming intolerant of intolerance. It's like, well, wait a minute. So we've got two laws now. So you can deconstruct everything but yourself. And Kierkegaard would say, not so fast. He critiques how deconstruction reverts to a rehash of the already discredited Enlightenment. The Enlightenment thought to create heaven on earth through rationalism, empiricism, and romanticism. These were the three wings of the Enlightenment. And it's going to be a sort of humanitarian utopia and all we needed to do was get rid of religion, right? That would work. And then we have World War I. And then we have World War II. And then we have Stalin and Hitler and Pol Pot and Mao. And they're a wonderful 20th century demonstration of how well humankind does when we just expunge religion. Well, in fact, the body count was pretty ugly on that. And in fact, it's as if in getting rid of the fear-based religion, it got rid of the brakes on the cruelty of humanity. And so if he were to speak to us today, I think he would look at the deconstruction movement and he would remind us that we've already tried just dismantling faith and erecting a humanistic utopia. And are we really going to do that again? And where will that go? And in fact, where is it going as we watch the polarization between ideologies these days? And somehow this has given rise to a whole new wave of fascist leadership across the nations, from Hungary to the Philippines, from Russia to America. There's a impulse towards authoritarianism at work. How did that happen? And how is that connected to religion? And how does the whole thing need to be deconstructed? And then again, he tells us, when doubts need to be welcomed. Don't get me wrong on that. I think part of the big problem in Christian church is we've not welcomed doubts, and that we've said, don't you dare question. And now the deconstructionists actually are rooted in a call to question. And I think that's incredibly important and prophetic. It is the tradition to question faith, to contest faith, to ask whether this faith is authentic or not. And so Kierkegaard is all over that. But, he says, remember that even doubt can be rooted in simple rebellion. That doubt can sometimes betray our reluctance to choose, to act, to obey, to follow. That doubt itself, and we're talking about the great doubter here, the great doubter has the capacity in himself to doubt, and to be able to see the shadow side of doubt, where it's like, that's not an authentic question. It's disingenuous rebellion, and I'm calling you on it. And this is how much integrity that I think Kierkegaard has. It's an integrity we didn't see in Christendom, and it's an integrity we often don't see in deconstructionism. And so I think he's a prophet for our age in that sense. And then he calls us finally to radical orthodoxy. It's not about doubling down on renewed church attendance. This isn't what we do with people who are making the mass exodus from Christendom. It's not about doubling down on orthodox Christian beliefs or doctrines. We tried that. Rather, here's what radical orthodoxy would be for Kierkegaard. First of all, it is the paradox of Christ himself. The socially insignificant God-man. Think about what that means. In what sense is Kierkegaard saying the paradox of Christ is we have the Lord of glory who then is incarnate as socially insignificant in terms of, the class that he was in terms of wealth. He's either a peasant or at best a blue collar. In terms of training, did he actually have rabbinical training? What is he doing talking in a synagogue? And there's a kind of social insignificance of being born into the society of Galilee, where under Roman occupation, and he doesn't have a big platform except the odd hill that people come to find him on. So radical orthodoxy for him begins with the person of Jesus Christ. And to the proud, Christ comes as a withering example who belittles spiritual pride by his demanding example. To the humble, he comes as pure compassion. And so in that sense, there is a judgment just by our orientation towards Christ. For those who are proud, Christ is one thing. To those who are humble, he's another. That's the judgment. It's the verdict that comes in the presence of Jesus Christ, and the verdict is like the fire, the arson that we pass through to see pride burnt up and humility forged, I suppose. So Christianity for Kierkegaard is nothing but from need, and that need is a relationship to Christ. Christianity is nothing but transformation, not of the intellect, but of the life and of the world. So the incredible importance of a living connection to this person, that's the heart of Christian orthodoxy. The incredible importance of a living connection that transforms us from the inside out by grace, and challenges our hardness of heart and welcomes us where we're broken of heart. Well, our final slide, I'm quoting from a website called eternalizedofficial.com. And here's the quote, because it brings Kierkegaard and Nietzsche together in their contesting of our faith and describes humanity at the crossroads, in the words of Kierkegaard. We face a crossroads at the dawn of the 21st century. The rapid advances and widespread successes of modern science force us to examine the same questions posed by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. As the domain of science grows ever more rapidly in explaining the features and behaviors of the empirical world, there is no need for appeal to God or any other transcendental reality. Is a return to a Christian worldview objectively possible? Is the absence of a religious model to explain the universe? Can those who do not possess such a faith in God construct their own moral standards, value, and meaning to fill the nihilistic void? The issue is so vital that it reaffirms the crucial importance of both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche in modern day society. Nietzsche saw where the arson of progressivism was leading, and it ultimately would be to a nihilistic kind of value-free darkness where the herd or the last man begins in meaninglessness but can't live there, and so begins to look for meaning, grope for it wherever it's offered. And that can be from outrageous people of poor character who know how to manipulate the herd because they're that cynical. Or, Kierkegaard says, you can contest your faith and find out there actually is a worldview that involves a way of living in this world, a way of trusting a living God, and a way of being that is authentic and has integrity. But you won't know it unless you pick up your cross and follow. So, who's in? Who is in? Nietzsche was not ultimately, or maybe ultimately he will be. But what we know is the Kierkegaard was all in on the Jesus following perspective. And so I present these two great figures, a beloved frenemy and antagonizing, provocative friend. And the two of those together may be good guides for us at the Crossroads. And I'd encourage you to check out my chapter on them in Out of the Embers. For now, that is it for our Quest for Meaning course. Again, we've looked carefully at Camus, Dostoevsky, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche with heavy doses of Simone Weil here and there. But there are far more examples of existentialism that you can study, and I hope you will. Their literature is well worth it, and particularly the fiction works where they are telling the story past the watchful dragons of our minds, and they get into the character of our heart. And I would recommend for further readings then, if you haven't read both of the assigned texts, do read the other one. And when you've done that, certainly check out Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov, which some regard as the greatest of novels in history. And that's a really good place to start. So if you have more questions about that, please contact me. And those who are writing papers for this course, please do let me know what you want to do with your paper. Thank you very much.